Everyone believed the queen had everything. She wore the crown. She lived inside the greatest palace in Britain. Thousands of people cheered whenever she appeared in public. But nobody knew the truth. Every night after the palace became silent, the queen walked alone through the long empty corridors carrying a small wooden box close to her heart. She always entered the same private room. She locked the door. She lit a single candle. Then she opened the wooden box. Inside were hundreds of handwritten letters. Every letter had been written by the queen herself. None of them had ever been sent. They were all addressed to the one person she loved more than the crown. Her husband. He had been gone for many years. But the queen never stopped writing to him. Every letter began the same way. Today I smiled for the kingdom. But tonight I miss you again. She wrote about lonely royal ceremonies. She wrote about standing on the palace balcony while thousands of people celebrated below. She wrote about sitting alone at long royal dinners surrounded by people yet feeling completely alone. Every page carried the pain she never allowed the world to see. To the people she looked strong. Inside she felt broken. The palace servants often wondered why the candle inside her private room burned until sunrise every single night. Nobody was ever allowed to enter. Nobody was allowed to touch the wooden box. The queen protected it more carefully than the royal jewels. Years passed. Her hair slowly turned silver. Her smile slowly disappeared. The people still called her the strongest queen in the world. But nobody noticed that she had stopped laughing many years earlier. Then one cold winter evening the queen quietly closed her final letter. She gently placed it inside the wooden box. She looked toward the empty chair beside the fireplace. Softly she whispered, "One day they will know why I never smiled again." The candle slowly burned lower. Outside heavy rain fell across the palace gardens. Inside someone was secretly watching through the small glass window of the old wooden door. Someone had finally discovered the queen's greatest secret. And everything was about to change. The following morning the queen left her private room before sunrise. She carried herself with the same dignity the nation had always admired. No one suspected that only a few hours earlier she had been writing another letter to the man she still loved. After the queen disappeared down the palace corridor, the mysterious watcher quietly entered the room. It was a young palace maid. She had served inside the palace for many years. She had never broken the queen's trust. But her curiosity had become stronger than her fear. The room was silent. The candle had almost burned away. On the wooden desk rested a single white rose. Beside it stood the small wooden box. The maid slowly reached toward it. For a moment she hesitated. Then she gently lifted the lid. Inside were hundreds of carefully folded letters. Every page carried the queen's elegant handwriting. The maid carefully opened the first letter. She expected to find royal orders or political secrets. Instead she found words filled with love, sorrow, and loneliness. The queen wrote that every public smile had hidden another private tear. She confessed that every royal celebration reminded her of the life she wished she could have shared with her husband. The maid could not stop reading. Every letter revealed another piece of the queen's broken heart. Then she discovered something unexpected. One letter was different from all the others. It was sealed with red wax. Across the front the queen had written only a few words. "To be opened after my final farewell." The maid's hands began to tremble. Before she could open the letter she heard footsteps outside the room. Someone was coming. She quickly placed every letter back inside the wooden box. But she had no time to hide. The door slowly opened. Standing in the doorway was the queen's personal secretary. He looked directly at the wooden box. Then he looked into the maid's frightened eyes. Without saying a single word he quietly closed the door behind him. The room became completely silent. The queen's personal secretary slowly walked toward the wooden box. The young maid stood frozen with fear. She believed her life inside the palace was about to end. The secretary looked at her for several moments. Then he quietly said, "You were never supposed to see those letters." The maid lowered her head and apologized. She admitted that curiosity had led her inside the room. The secretary took a deep breath. He carefully opened the wooden box. He gently touched the old letters as if they were priceless treasures. His eyes slowly filled with tears. He said he had protected the Queen's secret for more than 30 years. He had watched her write letter after letter every single night. He had never read a single page because he had promised the Queen that her private words would remain untouched. The maid asked one question. Why did the Queen never stop writing? The secretary looked toward the palace window. He quietly answered, because love never left her heart even after death separated them. The Queen believed that every letter brought her one step closer to the man she had lost. Every word gave her the strength to continue wearing the crown. Without those letters, she believed she would never have survived the loneliness of royal life. The maid looked at the hundreds of letters with new understanding. She finally realized the wooden box was more valuable than any royal jewel inside the palace. Then the secretary carefully removed the final sealed letter. He stared at it for several moments. The Queen had ordered that nobody should open it until after her final farewell. He whispered that day was coming sooner than anyone expected. Suddenly loud palace bells echoed across the courtyard. Servants began running through the corridors. Royal doctors hurried toward the Queen's private chambers. The secretary slowly closed his eyes. He knew something terrible had happened. The final letter would soon reveal the greatest truth the Queen had hidden from the world. The palace became silent in a way nobody had ever experienced before. The royal flags slowly lowered across the kingdom. Church bells echoed through cities, towns, and villages. The Queen had passed away. Millions of people gathered outside the palace carrying flowers and candles. They remembered a strong queen who had devoted her entire life to the crown. But nobody knew the sorrow she had carried inside her heart every single day. Inside the palace, the personal secretary and the young maid stood alone in the private room. The small wooden box rested on the table exactly where the Queen had left it. The secretary slowly picked up the final sealed letter. For many years he had protected it. Now the moment had finally arrived. With trembling hands he carefully opened the seal. The room became completely silent. The Queen's final words were written with calm and beautiful handwriting. She wrote that the crown had given her duty, honor, and respect. But it had never healed the emptiness left by the man she loved. She thanked her people for trusting her. She thanked every servant who had stood beside her through the years. Then she made one final request. She asked that her letters should never be burned. She wanted the world to know that behind every royal ceremony stood a woman who loved deeply and grieved quietly. She hoped that one day people would remember not only the Queen they saw in public, but also the woman they never truly knew. Tears filled the eyes of the secretary. The young maid quietly wiped away her tears. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Then the secretary gently closed the final letter and placed it back inside the wooden box. He whispered that the Queen had trusted them with the greatest treasure she had ever left behind. At that very moment, another palace official entered the room. He looked at the wooden box and gave a cold order. Destroy every letter before sunrise. No one must ever read them. The room fell completely silent. The secretary looked at the palace official with disbelief. The young maid held the wooden box tightly against her chest. Neither of them wanted the Queen's final wish to be forgotten. The palace official repeated his order. Every letter must disappear before sunrise. The secretary slowly shook his head. He said the Queen had trusted them with her final words. He could not betray that trust. The official stepped closer. He warned that if the letters became public, the world would see a different side of the Queen. The secretary quietly replied, "That is exactly what she wanted. She wanted people to know that behind every crown there is a human heart." The official remained silent. For the first time he realized that these letters were not a political secret. They were the life of a woman who had sacrificed everything for her people. As the first light of morning entered the room, the secretary carried the wooden box to the palace gardens. The young maid followed beside him. Together they placed the box inside a beautiful glass case in the private royal archive where it would be protected for generations. Years later, historians finally discovered the collection of letters. People from across Britain came to read the words of the Queen. Many expected to find royal secrets. Instead, they found love, loneliness, hope, faith, and the quiet strength of a woman who carried the weight of a kingdom while hiding the pain inside her own heart. From that day forward, people remembered her for more than the crown. They remembered her kindness, her courage, her devotion, and the love she never stopped carrying. Perhaps the greatest treasure a queen can leave behind is not a palace or a crown, but a heart that remained faithful until its very last beat. And that is why history remembers her as the queen who never smiled again.